Now I'm going to introduce here a tool that I have been kind of on purpose. I have been leaving out of the previous chapters. Um, and this is called the visual inspector in A-frame. I'm sure that some of you have already found out and used it, so that's okay. I usually leave this to a more advanced uh, time, because it's important to be able to manually to position and to rotate objects in our 3D scene, um, and being able to do that in our own head, just being able to understand what should be the position of an object inside the scene and then just writing out the code for it. But there are many situations where that's really hard. In some cases, it's really impossible. So in some situations, we really need a visual way of placing objects in relation to one another. And that's where the visual inspector comes in. So the visual inspector is a tool that comes with A-frame, so you don't need to do anything to get it. You just need to access it. And you access it by pressing shortcut keys on your keyboard. So when you load A-frame environment, if you press Control, Alt, and I at the same time, this will open up the visual inspector. I'll just show you here very quickly. So if you are in an example, an A-frame example, and you press Control, Alt, and I, this will open up the inspector. And just to give you an overview of the main areas, and later on I'll show you some more specific stuff. But so the main areas in that inspector, on the left side, we have the scene hierarchy. So for example, in this scene from the previous example, if we look at the left side, we will see the A scene element, and we can actually open or close the element. So there's an arrow to expand the content. And we can see that inside the scene element, we have a box, then a sphere, then a camera, and then some two entities which are actually lights. We'll talk about this later on. So we have our elements that constitute the 3D scene. In this case, it's a simple scene, so we don't have any more nesting in the elements, but we could have so elements with other elements inside. And so here we can navigate through the scene. So if I wanted, for example, to inspect the box object, I can just click on it. And if you click on an element here in the scene hierarchy, on the right side, you will see the attributes for that object. So here, if I select the box, then a panel opens up on the right, and I can see the attributes for the box. So I can see, for example, the position, the rotation, the scale, and lots of other attributes if you scroll down. Don't worry too much about those attributes that are below there. So the most important ones are actually the ones on the top. So the position and rotation and the scale of the element, the 3D object. Another important area is the toolbar in the top. So there's 3 buttons, and they actually represent tools for moving the object, for translating the object, changing its position. Another tool to rotate the object, changing the rotation. And the last tool to change the scale of the object. So we can just use, or maybe before we use these tools, um, just one other manipulation that's important to know how to do is to change your perspective here inside the scene. And to do that, you just click and drag your mouse. Inside the visual inspector, the directional keys don't work, so we cannot move inside the environment as we did in before with the directional keys. We can just change our orientation by clicking and dragging, and we can also use the mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out. So this kind of allows us to move forward and back. We can also kind of move to the sides by clicking and dragging with the right mouse button. So the left mouse button will change your perspective if you click and drag. The right mouse button will change your kind of position. And you can change, you can drag to the sides or up and down. But if you want to move forward, then you use the mouse wheel to go forward or go back. Honestly, this kind of controls, to me, they are always very hard to remember. So, but it's not really important that you try to remember all of this, because you can just try it out and you will see what happens when you click and drag. So it's not really a very important thing. It's just important that you know that these things are possible to do. And then let's say, for example, one last thing that we can do before we manipulate the object, because sometimes, let's say, we have an object that is very far away or that's behind us and we don't really know where it is. One of the useful things that we have in this visual inspector is the possibility of finding an object. And to find an object, you can just select it on the scene hierarchy here on the left, and then just press the F key on the keyboard. You can think of the F key as in focus or in finding. And this will take you almost inside the object. I'm not sure where it actually takes you, in what point in space it will actually take you, but it will take you very near that object. So now we can just go back a bit with the mouse wheel so that we see the whole object in front of us. And then, of course, we can change our perspective and then manipulate the object. So I'm going to select again the object, and then with the tools in the toolbar, the one that is selected by default is the translate tool, which will change the position. We can just click on those arrows. These arrows, they represent the axis, the X, Y, and Z axis. And we can just drag the objects by the axis. And you'll see as I drag the object, the position is changing. If you select the rotate, then instead of arrows, you get these circles around the object, and then you can just rotate along each axis. One thing that you need to be careful, and you probably already noticed it happening, is that sometimes the object is deselected automatically. I'm not sure why this happens, but it happens. So you need to keep selecting the object in order to manipulate it. And then the final one is the scale, and the scale, we can change the scale of only one axis, and that will deform the object. So it was a cube and it's no longer a cube. Or we can, if we grab by the center with this tool selected, we will keep the ratio of the object on all three axes. So we can just enlarge or reduce the object. Okay, so the visual inspector allows you to do this, and sometimes it's a really useful tool. Now, one of the limitations of this tool, it's actually written here, make sure that you don't miss this, is that the edits that we do in the visual inspector, so the things that I just did here, they are not permanent. If I reload the scene, for example, going back to the scene, I can go back to the scene and then see how it looks. But if I reload the web page, then they are gone. Those changes are gone. So the edits are not permanent. As soon as we reload the web page, they are lost. So how do we do things? Well, we need to copy the values back to our source code. So for example, if I am going to enter again the visual inspector, if I didn't like where the box was, and I wanted to change maybe the position or even the scale of the box, I wanted something like this. In order to make it permanent, then I would have to look at these values and then edit the values for the position, for the scale, and the rotation in my source code. So I'd have to copy the values and paste them here. In order to copy and paste, there's actually here a button that copies the entire entity. But this usually, when you copy this one, and when you press this button, this usually copies a lot of kind of garbage. I'll show you. So in some situations, if you just want to update the position, it's sometimes easier to just write manually the new values. But I'm going to copy the whole thing and show you when we paste. So you see that it will add some new attributes that were not in the original ones. So we'd have to delete this. And then you also see that for the rotation, some of the values for the rotation and for the scale and the position, they have lots of decimal places that are really not needed. So kind of the code kind of becomes a bit less readable. So I usually just manually copy the values to the source code, or if I copy with that button, then I edit things in order for the code to be a bit more readable. So I just, for example, 3 decimal places is usually more than enough. So I will just adjust these values, and then we could delete this one. So this and this, it would be the same thing. So we could just delete this one or copy this back to the first one. So this is important. Remember, the Visual Inspector does not make permanent changes. Now, one of the difficult things to do in 360 scenes, particularly scenes like the one that we have here. So scenes that have a 360 panorama, but that also have artificial elements inside. So they have boxes and spheres and whatever, or 3D models, whatever. One of the difficult things to do is to properly align the 3D objects with the 360 photo, because as we just saw, a small difference in perspective, if the user was allowed to move, would mean that the objects were no longer well adjusted. So if I was able to change my perspective here inside this 360 photo, this box would not look like it was resting on the table. So things need to be kind of precisely aligned, otherwise the illusion breaks. So the thing is, how can we align things? Just like it was on that example with that box, although in that case it was very simple, the box that looked like it was resting on top of the table in the classroom. Basically, I align things by using the visual inspector. But there's a slight thing that is important to be aware, and that's why I'm going to show you how I do it with the visual inspector. I've also done a video that explains the process, but because there's really some specific things that I think they are important, so I'll demonstrate here. And then the video that has subtitles to try to explain. So if you miss something, you can also then watch the video. But I'll do here a demonstration also. So let's say I'm going to change a bit this example, and for example, let's insert a different element. So let's say we have let's try to place a cylinder. I'm going to use the same example as I did in the video, the same kind of object. I could use a different one, but my imagination it's not that good. So let's add a cylinder to this scene, and let's make it a red cylinder, or yeah, it can be a red cylinder. And I'm just leaving it at this. I'll here in the code for now, and let's align this cylinder with a 360 photo by using the inspector. So let's get back to our scene. I'm going to reload, and now there's a cylinder. It's not immediately visible because I haven't placed it, so it's at 0, 0, 0. It's right on my feet. So let's try to put the cylinder on top of another table, or maybe on the ground, just to be different from the video. So let's enter the visual inspector, and let's locate the cylinder. And I'll first to demonstrate, I'll do this the wrong way first. So we have the cylinder. I'm just going to move it. So let's say here in our scene, let's say I wanted the cylinder right in that corner of the classroom, yeah, on the floor. So maybe I could do this. I'm sure you are already seeing some weird stuff. But let's go ahead. So it seems from this perspective, it seems okay. So the cylinder is roughly on the floor in the corner of the room. Let's get back to the scene and see where it stands. So it's actually not that bad by coincidence. But it seems to be a bit overlapping the chair. So this actually didn't work quite as well as I wanted to show you why this is wrong. because it kind of worked. But you see, there is some strange thing here, because we are seeing the white cube here floating in the air. So what's wrong with this? Well, the problem is that the perspective that we have inside the visual inspector is not the user's perspective. And it's easy to understand why it isn't the same perspective as the user, why it can't be the same perspective, because here we see all the objects, including the camera, and the camera represents the perspective of the user. So when we are in this visual inspector, we are acting like, kind of like gods. We see everything. And we don't necessarily see things from the perspective of a single thing in the scene, or the perspective of a user inside that scene. So we are kind of above all that. But for positioning, for aligning objects with a 360 photo, we need to be in the eyes of the user. So we actually need to be able to position things correctly. We need first to be in the position of the camera. And one way to do that is to select the camera here on the left side, use the F key to find it, to focus on the camera. And the camera is a special object because it doesn't really have a visual representation on the scene. But on the visual inspector, it has this kind of abstract representation. I'm going to move back from the camera just to try to show you that representation of the camera. So you see, I'm going to move a bit more to the back. So you see these actually two lines that intersect each other. This is actually representing the camera. I'm going to focus again on it. And we really, and now we see another 4 lines. And basically this together with the other 2 that intersect, they kind of represent the lens of the camera. And in order to be at the right position, we need to move forward into the camera, more or less until we stop seeing that center point, that intersection between those lines. I'm not sure if you are able to see this because the lines are very thin. You really have to try this on your computer. I'm not sure if you can see this through Zoom streaming. But so what I do is I enter the camera, I zoom in to the camera until I stop seeing that intersection. And roughly like this. And this is roughly the perspective of the user in the scene. And now we have to be careful not to move out of this perspective. We can just rotate. We cannot move out of this perspective, otherwise we will lose the perspective of the user and the positioning of our elements will not be correct. So now that we are in the correct perspective, we can select the cylinder and move it to the correct location and maybe adjust its size. And if we needed to, we could also adjust the rotation to make sure that it seems like it is well aligned with the floor. And this, of course, it's very difficult to do. So you really have to do this kind of by trial and error. Sometimes just put it in a perspective that seems correct to you. And then we can test, can go back to the scene without reloading the web page to see if it looks good. Okay, seems okay. And now we can go back to the inspector. After you open the inspector once, then a button appears here on the left, so you don't need to use the keyboard shortcut all the time. And now we can just select the cylinder, and we can just copy these values back to our code. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm copying the entire entity and just paste here below the one that I want. Actually, here it didn't work. This is a bug, I think. I'm not sure what happens, but sometimes the copy button doesn't copy everything. So in this case, we'll need to manually input these values. So let's go here to our cylinder and enter position equals, and then manually put those values. So 948, 7, minus 2, 215, minus 6, 096 for the position, and for the rotation for 198. And the scale, finally. Zero, 6, 7, 8. 0359, and the last one 0651. Okay, and now we can test things and see if this is really the correct position and rotation, and see if we didn't make any mistake when copying the values. So we just reload now the web page, and so it seems to be okay. So this is a bit time consuming, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a little easier to do.